Welcome to the latest installment of Insight Vox, which is UK Column's standalone interview series for distinguished guests. I'm delighted to say that we're talking to Joel Skousen today. He's a political scientist by training, specializing in the philosophy of law and constitutional theory, largely from the US perspective, but he's also very versed in Europe. And interestingly, Joel has also become a designer of high security residences and retreats. He's designed self-sufficient and high-security homes throughout North America and has acted as a consultant in many places, including Central America. His latest book on survival is called Strategic Relocation, and that's tailored to the North American context, but I'll be asking him about Europe in this episode. Joel was raised in Oregon and later served as a fighter pilot for the US Marine Corps during the Vietnam era. During the 1980s, so when he was in his 30s, he took a leave of absence to serve as the chairman of the Conservative National Committee in Washington, D.C. during the Reagan era. And at the same time, he was executive editor of a publication called the Conservative Digest, quite an influential publication in its day. For 2 years, he also published a newsletter called the World Affairs Brief, and I'm glad to say Joel has resurrected the World Affairs Brief online recently. And he was also senior editor of Cogitations, a quarterly journal on law and government. And the reason we're talking to Joel today is because of the heightened talk of the risk of nuclear conflict in the world, and because of his 30 to 40 years experience analysing a core topic of UK column interest, which is globalism, globalists, and moves towards one world government, and particularly technology transfer out of Western countries. Joel, welcome. It's very good to have you with us.
Yes, it's so good to be with you, Alex. I followed your work for a considerable time, and I'm a great fan of what you do there in the UK.
Let's start with your earlier life then. Many people will be aware of your uncle W. Cleon Skousen, who wrote a pair of quite celebrated books, the first called The Naked Communist and the second called The Naked Capitalist. Effectively, he was describing the problems in the early post-war era, wasn't he, with both of the blocs that there were in the world at that time. But rather than propose a radical or anarchist solution, he went for what the Anglo-American tradition calls libertarianism. And I think that it's fair to say that you and your two brothers, who are also quite renowned authors in their own right, have gone to libertarianism, but not in all regards. And that's largely because you're Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So tell us something about your upbringing and how you politically evolved through your youth.
Well, I was very much influenced by my uncle's work clear back as early as my high school years, about 17 years old when I read The Naked Communist. What was very interesting to me, however, was that uh, the prevailing theory during the McCarthy years was that the State Department of the United States was infiltrated by a lot of communists, and it was, especially the Roosevelt administration and the follow-on Truman administration. But what I noticed in his book, especially the stories about the loss of Cuba, was that there were a lot of people higher up than the communists who were protecting them from being removed from the State Department. And that led Clinton to discovered through the work of Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope. He was a globalist who basically objected to the globalists keeping their agenda secret and thought that it should be public. He was proud of it. And so he revealed, I think, a little too much in his book about the globalists, their control of both political parties in the United States and in the UK, as well as their control of the media, which is very, very complete. And so I was very much influenced by that. And after my uncle's death, and through my work as political scientist and in the military, when I saw the Vietnam War being, how should I say, manipulated to lose, um, our squadrons, when we were flying in Vietnam, couldn't even arm our missiles until we were being attacked. It was like fighting with one hand behind your back. They had safe areas where the North Vietnamese could retreat across the border into Laos and that we couldn't bomb them. Uh, Certain missile sites were off limits and key strategic targets were off limits so that we really couldn't win the war. But in fact, I discovered in the military that we actually did win the war. The bombing of the Air Force of North Vietnam was very, very effective and brought them basically to the negotiating table in Paris. prepared to capitulate. And then Henry Kissinger, a very renowned globalist, gave it away at the negotiating table. He had made a deal with Red China that we're going to yield, and we just ask that you give us 3 years before you take back the South so that we don't lose face. That was a great breach of humanity to betray a nation like South Korea after spending so many American lives and money in trying to defend that. In subsequent years, a lot of people asked me, why did the globalists do this? As we see them take a different tact about war now. War is celebrated. War is created in the sense of it's a great propaganda value. They play on American patriotism. They play on British patriotism in the war against the so-called war on terror. It's my theory, Alex, that the globalists wanted to destroy in America any sentiment for any more wars of liberation against communism. They didn't. Communism is used by globalism basically to break down the social order of a country. They come in then and overthrow the communist regimes and replace it with what they call free market, but it isn't free market. Globalism is really a socialist philosophy that only fronts as free market. It's more like corporatism, where you bring in corporate relations with government and you give them advantages, you draw people in and you control them. So it's a very, very sophisticated, deceptive philosophy. But going back to my background, after Mormon boys are expected to go on a mission, I went on a mission to South America to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when I came back, the Vietnam War was raging. My draft number was going to be probably high, and so I went and enlisted in the military services. And because I had private pilot experience, I went into the Marine Corps that offered that you'd get Navy flight training, which is the most rigorous of all flight training, doing carrier landings, etc., as well as give you combat training, because I know the chances were high that you would be shot down in Vietnam, as many of our colleagues were, and Air Force colleagues. And the Air Force was offering 45 minutes of pistol training before you became a pilot. And the Marine Corps was offering full combat training. And so that's the route that I went. I flew F-4 Phantoms during the Vietnam era, and it was a wonderful experience. That is the training. And then I found that there was a lot of corruption in the military, and it wasn't the honor and integrity that the Marine Corps had sold to the public or myself. And being that I had high Christian moral values, I found that I was on the other side of the squadron commander who wanted to hold stag parties with nude women and prostitutes present, and you weren't supposed to tell your wives, and I refused to attend. And various other young Christian pilots took my cue and refused to attend as well, so we had kind of a mini rebellion going on in the squadron. And that ended up in my being removed from the squadron eventually after my training was complete and sent up to higher headquarters where I would not safely interfere or threaten to expose their agenda. This was pre-tailhook, if you remember the tailhook scandal in the Navy, and much of that has been resolved after the tailhook scandal, but it was very sad at the time.
So that's something if you're becoming disillusioned with how the military was run, although certainly I don't think becoming disenamored of what the military is there for. I think you're very much still a proponent of that, as I am. That takes us also to the time of the Reagan era, which closely overlaps the Thatcher era. And in that you began to write. You wrote your first book, Essential Principles for the Conservation of Liberty, which came out in 1984. And that really is where you set out your ideological stall, which I think hasn't changed much. Tell us something about what the essential principles are that you have discovered, because we've been exchanging ideas recently, and you've pointed out, I think perfectly correctly, that even those of us who believe in God-given rights do not look to a particular book or part of Scripture for those rights. Our political rights are not enumerated in any part of Scripture. Instead, we are left to find them out by convention. Of course, many old English bills and acts begin with the phrase, whereas it hath been found by experience. And I think you take the same approach, that we find from history and from meditation what our God-given rights are. So please tell us something about your philosophy of government and liberty that you unfold in Essential Principles for the Conservation of Liberty.
Well, thank you, Alex. It has been a very important struggle. My family background and Mormons in general come from a very conservative background that reveres the Constitution of the United States as an inspired document. And indeed it is, although I find it highly imperfect in many ways, in that it isn't a tight legal language doctrine. It espouses certain principles of limited government and separations of powers, but much of these were compromises because they didn't have a way to tie down government in tight legal language to keep from interpreting. And it was fine for the first 100 years when people closely remembered the intent of the founding fathers, and many judges tried to abide by that. But then, because of the lack of tight legal language restricting government, they used certain clauses in the U.S. Constitution to expand the powers of government until we are today, where essentially we have the government doing anything that the Constitution doesn't prohibit. Instead of the original intent of the Constitution, you can't do anything except what we specifically say you can do in the Constitution. And so I set about to rewrite a tight legal language version of the Constitution. And listeners who are interested can see that on my site at joelskousen.com. It's under the banner of Law and Government, where I outline how to take the principles of common law and the U.S. Constitution and tighten down the language so that, in fact, it does prohibit. One of the interesting things you do when you do that is that it no longer becomes a matter of term limits where you have to stop bad people from being in office more than 8 years, etc. Basically, the Constitution literally prohibits bad lawmaking. It is, as a Constitution is truly designed, a limit on the legislative powers of the Constitution. Because, even majority rule, whether it's parliamentary or the U.S. Constitution, can be corrupted by the majority. If the majority becomes socialist and they want to vote themselves benefit, it ultimately becomes like two wolves and a sheep voting on dinner, and the majority is going to win. So democracy is not the ultimate, in my view. It is constitutionally limited powers which establish fundamental rights, a true definition of fundamental rights. And that's perhaps my greatest contribution to political theory in the United States, is a really workable definition of fundamental rights that people can rely on, that the law can rely on, so that courts do not simply invent rights like the right to an abortion or the right to medical care or the right to an education. So here's my definition of Alex of fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are those rights which all persons can simultaneously claim without forcing other people to serve their needs. Now, what does this do? It is a workable definition because you can say, well, under that definition, there are two aspects. One is simultaneity. In other words, it's not that some people can claim rights to free medical care while the others can't. Everybody, to be a fundamental right, has to be able to claim together the same right without forcing someone to serve their needs. So we can apply this to education. Can everyone claim the right of an education without forcing someone to build the schools or teach the classes? No, you can't. Can everyone claim free education? No, because you have to force someone to provide the money, the hospitals, the doctors, etc. But can everybody voluntarily contract together to do things without coercion? Yes, they can. So the right of contract is a fundamental right. Can everyone claim their own right? Yes, they can. Their own right to life, as long as you don't force someone to serve your needs. You can claim the right of property legitimately and voluntarily by exchange that is gained because no one is forced to serve your needs. So it becomes a very workable definition. And from that, I've developed a whole set of principles, 8 or 10 principles about taxation and about how you establish a government. You cannot establish it by force or even by majority. And people say, well, how do you ever get people to all agree to a proper system of government? And my philosophy is that you basically start with an inner core and you say, we agree that these are the fundamental rights of man. We sign on and we pledge that we will do this. And then you go out to convert other people to join that system until you basically get big enough that you have some territoriality and you say, now, if you want to join our system, you have to sign on to the Constitution that you agree that you will not take away or use force to take away other people's rights. And we have a free market system of education and economy here, and it will prosper, and it does prosper. And so people want to join, they have to sign on to the compact. So it's a signature document that people sign on. When you become children, you live under the rights of your parents, but when you become of age, for example, 18, you have to become a citizen, not by birth, but by qualification. And it's like an open book test. We don't care how you learn it as long as you know the law, and you don't have to know all the technicalities, but you know the Constitution, you agree and sign that you will abide by those things, you become a citizen. So this way, we no longer have ignorant people being born into a Constitution which they don't understand, taught in public schools to revere socialism and not the free market. And so we're raising people who end up destroying English common law and destroying the US Constitution because they're never required to qualify. And so that's basically how I view constitutional law and theory. And even though I believe that God wants us to have our fundamental rights, I'm also a believer that you don't have to have a religious test. You can sign on. Everyone of whatever religion can see that these laws are the fairest and non-conflicting of any system that man can develop.
Joel, what you're saying is very interesting, particularly the three-cornered hat in Eurasia, which you bring out between Israel, Russia, and China, and the technology transfers between them. But you've already indicated to us that there is not an identity between communism and globalism. Sometimes we are accused of using globalism and globalists as cover terms for Jews or for Zionists, or at times we're accused of using globalism as cover terms for socialism. But you've already indicated that globalism is not the same as that. In fact, there are times when one of the movements takes the upper hand above another, and then after a couple of generations, we see another movement arising, but the same globalist agenda keeps pushing forward. So my question would be, what is globalism? What kind of ideology is it? And leading on from that, who are globalists and what motivates them?
Well, that's a very good question, Alex. It's a little bit complex, but let me try to tackle that. Um, Globalism actually has been going on, I have discovered, for many centuries, even though it's been known by different names. I guess it really surfaced originally as a countermeasure to the U.S. Constitution and the movement for libertarian in Europe, and so they morphed into many different types of aims. Whether it's, sometimes they morphed into Masonry, and then they morphed into other organizations. Uh, so I will restrain my analysis basically to the 20th century and beyond, because that's where we can track them most openly. But globalism is a secretive society, a secret combination of power, if you will, that seeks to destroy national sovereignty, and through using conflict creation and crisis to force people to give up constitutional law, constitutional restrictions, and form a global government governed by them under the deceptive image of free markets, of they will still say that you're free. They will still, I mean, the EU Constitution is the perfect model of the globalist Constitution. And in fact, the EU, the European Union, is a regional form of globalism. You have, if you look at the EU Constitution, it's very interesting because they guarantee you all your rights, but they're so skewed in their definition. For example, we have the right of property is absolute, except when society needs your property. The right of a family to govern their own affairs is absolute in the EU, except when society, the needs of society deem that they can override that. Well, those are not absolute rights when they can be overridden by the majority rule, which is fluid and not fixed. And so what's interesting about globalism is how they have used communism and how they use socialism, and they use terms of freedom to deceive people. As my uncle pointed out in The Naked Communist, um, there were a lot of communists in the State Department, but there was one particular individual named Alger Hiss who was very key in bringing communists into the Roosevelt administration. And he, in fact, did join the Communist Party, though he denied it vehemently. But Whittaker Chambers, a principled communist who converted to Christianity and pulled out of communism, revealed that Alger Hiss, in fact, was a communist. And so Alger Hiss was sent to prison for many years for perjury uh, because of his lying to the committees about his communist affiliations. But I'm convinced, Alex, that Alger Hiss was in fact a globalist who went and joined the Communist Party in order to make them think that he was one of them so that they wouldn't wonder too much about his influence in the Roosevelt administration, bringing all these communists in, like Harry Hopkins and others. Um, Alger Hiss ended up writing the UN Constitution, and it's no wonder, being a globalist and a communist at the same time, that he put in a lot of powers into the UN Charter that allowed for the Russians and the communists to have key aspects of the UN. For example, during the Korean War, a Soviet general was always in charge of the UN military operations. And so the US, Douglas MacArthur, had to tell the UN what he was doing and what his plans were to invade North Korea. And of course, the Russians told the Chinese, and that's why the Chinese invaded to stop the US. So it was a very evil conspiracy of power. But a lot of people have thought incorrectly that the globalists are basically communists of another viewpoint, but they aren't. They are a more carefully crafted form of socialism or communism, masquerading as a mixed market, more like Fabian socialism that you're familiar with. But they do use communists to break down the social order, and so that they can come in and rescue it. And so that's why the U.S. ended up, and the best information from books like Dagger in the Heart of Cuba by Mario Lasso talks about how Cuba was lost through CIA influence. The CIA secretly shipped arms to Fidel Castro, and then they cut off arms to Batista so that he could not win. They did the same thing to bring the communists to power in China. They cut off arms to Chiang Kai-shek and allowed Mao to continue to be armed and forced Chiang into a coalition government with Mao, which he could not win and could not suppress. So, even during Lend-Lease during World War II, through Harry Hopkins and other communists in the State Department or in the White House, the Roosevelt administration shipped the rest of the nuclear plans to Russia that they could not steal through the Manhattan Project. Through Lend-Lease, and Major Jordan, who was in charge of Lend-Lease at this Air Force base in Montana, discovered this. He confiscated the plans in these 6 big black trunks that were being shipped to Russia. He called the White House to tell him about it, and Harry Hopkins told him to close those trunks back up, give them to the Russians, and never tell anyone about it. Well, the U.S. also ended up shipping to Russia its first shipment of enriched uranium so that Russia could set off its first nuclear explosion within a year after Hiroshima. So you might ask, what were these globalists doing? Arming a country like Russia, giving them nuclear weapons, and then the Russians arming the Chinese. As the late Stanley Monteith said, he said, they were building the best enemies that money could buy. In other words, the globalists want war. And so they built these 2 major enemies, Russia and China, to eventually have a major conflict, which will, and my theory is, Alex, that because of a unique change in nuclear doctrine in the United States called Presidential Decision Directive 60, 1997, where they had Bill Clinton sign this new document. He didn't write it, but he signed it, instructing the military to not seek to win a nuclear war anymore, but to be prepared to absorb a nuclear first strike and retaliate afterwards. That's the essence of what PDD 60 says. Now, everyone's forgotten about it now, but it's still in force. Our military practices launch on warning. And what that means is that when our satellites detect a Russian or Chinese nuclear missile launch or North Korean, they can launch missiles before those missiles arrive on station and destroy the country. The one who launches second really wins the nuclear war because the one who launches first, its missiles hit empty silos, and US missiles are already in the air and they win, basically. So by telling the military, don't expect to use launch on warning, but to be prepared to launch a retaliatory strike, we're setting the United States up for failure in a preemptive nuclear strike. General Butch Neal of the Marine Corps, when he heard about PDD 60, says, retaliate with what? You know, after you've absorbed a nuclear first strike, all you've got is your nuclear submarines, and actually only half of those. Because in that same year, 1997, Bill Clinton made a deal unilaterally with the Russians to say, we will agree to keep 50% of our Trident nuclear submarines in port at any one time to make sure that they're more easily targetable. This is a gesture of goodwill to show Russia that we have no hegemonic feelings toward Russia, that we'll make ourselves vulnerable. Well, Bill Clinton, when he said that, of course, was following globalist orders. And basically, it's my theory that the globalists intend, through their control of both political parties, to set up the U.S. for weakness. That's why in the past 3 years, we just removed 3 warheads off our remaining Minuteman missiles and replaced them with a single warhead. Unilateral disarmament while the USSR and the continuing Soviets, as Christopher Story in the UK used to call them, he was one of the 2, myself and Christopher Story, who said openly that the fall of the Soviet Union was a carefully crafted deception, that the communists simply went underground and faked their own demise. They told Erich Honecker and Ceausescu and other dictators in Europe to allow these protests to go forward, to not intervene with the Stasi, just like the KGB did not intervene with the so-called fall of the Soviet Union. All of this was a carefully crafted deception, warned about in a book by Golitsyn called New Lies for Old. I'm sure you're familiar with that. But what's interesting about globalism is that the globalists knew that this was happening and they never blew the whistle on Russia. I mean, I was writing in my World Affairs Brief, which started about that time, and I said, look, how is it that the KGB, after overthrowing numerous governments around the world, could not capture Gorbachev in his undefended villa? How did that fail? How did the heads of the GRU, the KGB, and the defense minister flee for their lives? Who were they fleeing from? I mean, these people supposedly had all the reins of power in Russia. Who were they fleeing from, as the media so easily accepted? Well, I said these were not the true leaders of the Soviet Union. These were just mid-level bureaucrats 2 or 3 years before that had been risen to these positions in order to take the fall. Gorbachev himself was a mid-level arms negotiator 3 years before becoming prime minister. So who picked him? Who put him into position of power? Well, it was people like Boris Berezovsky, who surfaced to become the head of the Commonwealth of Independent States. In fact, all of the true communist bosses under the surface behind the Politburo came out and made themselves wealthy. They did that, of course, by ordering the state bank to give them massive loans so they could buy out Gazprom and all the other prominent. That's how the original globalists became wealthy. They were the original communist leaders, in my opinion.
And so, Joel, we're left with this situation now where Putin, rather like Stalin in his later years, seems to have gone off reservation in that both of these Russian leaders were picked by the Russian end of the globalist conspiracy, as it were, in order to further the aims of that. But both of them, more particularly now Putin, said in their later years, when established, no, actually, I'm first and foremost a Russian patriot. Um, Putin has clearly gone off reservation, in my opinion, and so he's resisting a lot of what you've talked about. And yet we see that globalism continues undeserved, almost right under Putin's nose, don't we? That there's many people, particularly in the what you call the Euro-Atlantic integration mindset in Russia, in the banking, for example, and in some of the other ministries, that simply wants to continue as things were. The uranium you mentioned, and that's continued under Hillary Clinton's Secretary of Stateship. Uranium from the US is going off to Russia even as we speak. So whatever kind of ideologies prevail in Russia, China, and Israel, that triangle of Eurasia, we could say, we still see the same things happening. How can we actually put a stop to this from our respective countries, from the US and Britain, which seem to be two of the main headquarters of globalist thinking, as ordinary concerned citizens? What can we do?
Well, first of all, I think we have to attack the problem by calling a spade a spade. We have to talk openly about that this is a conspiracy of power. And we have to educate people on how very sophisticated it is so that they can see through it. And that's a very difficult task. The media will literally crucify anyone who gets up in front of normal television and to talk about the things that I just said about the phony fall of the Soviet Union. Or I can, in my World Affairs brief, I talk about the Iran deal, how that was a conspiracy. You know, how the US and Britain went to Iran and said, let's make a deal. And Iran says, hey, you've been persecuting us for years and suddenly you want to make a deal? And they said, yeah, we'll make it easy on you. You won't have to give up hardly anything in your nuclear program, and we will give you peace and take away your sanctions. And Iran bought into this, and then the next day, Secretary of State Kerry gets into the television and says, Iran agreed to this and this and this and this. And Iran said, no, we didn't. And we've got the transcripts to prove it. But you see, the US got them into agreeing to a deal and then upped the ante by saying that they agreed to things more strict than what they did. But Iran so desperately wanted to get rid of the sanctions, they went along with it. The US did this 2 more times, including in the 3rd round of the negotiation, adding in conventional weapons to the nuclear deal, which Iran had not agreed to. But they went along with it. I mean, this is a complete deception. And why did this happen? Because I'll tell you frankly, Israel, which was going to originally start this war with Iran, remember in 2007 and 8 and 9 and even before, the US was rattling the sabers. They had 3 aircraft carrier groups off of Iran going to attack it. And Israel was supposed to start it. In fact, in the UK, in the city of London, there was a high-level meeting, and I covered this in the World Affairs brief, and they invited in a high financier in the city of London who was not a conspirator in globalism. He got invited to this meeting, everyone thinking that he was one of us, but he wasn't. He gets into the meeting, and he was just shocked to find them talking about things like globalism, Russia and China, and a future war, and how displeased the globalists were that Israel had not followed through and attacked Iran to start this war. And he came out and he spoke to one of the UK conspiracy sites about his thing, and I quoted it in the World Affairs brief. He didn't really understand everything that was going on because, this was all new to him, and he was, quite perplexed. But what really happened is that Israel said to the United States, we're not going to attack Iran until you take Syria out of the way. Because Syria is right next door. They can obliterate us with all their Scud missiles and their chemical weapons. And that's when the U.S. conjured up this false flag attack of chemical weapons in the suburb of Ghouta in Damascus in 2013. Obama had put a red line, and he said, now we're going to make sure they cross that red line by the rebels who we support, who we have given chemical weapons to through Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They will create this attack, and then we can blame Assad. And they did that. So John Kerry gets up at a press conference in London in 2013, and a reporter asks him and says, it's very obvious that you're going to attack Syria with this so-called no-fly zone, just like you attacked Libya under the cover of a no-fly zone. Is there anything that Syria could do to avoid this attack, Mr. Secretary? And Kerry just off the top of his head said, oh, yes, they could give up their chemical weapons and we wouldn't attack. And Assad said, yes, we agree. And Russia said, we agree. I'll bet you that Kerry just got a tongue lashing when he got off that stage. You know, you fools, said his advisor. You just ruined our plans. You gave them an out. And that is why the US and British intelligence had to come in and create ISIS afterwards because Assad complied. They couldn't attack. They had to have another reason to attack. And they decided we're going to take about half of the Syrian rebels and we'll call them ISIS. I mean, that's how ISIS came about out of nowhere. Suddenly 60,000 fighters and huge arm depots. This could only have happened not naturally, but through U.S. and British intelligence doing this. And so ISIS was created, set off against Iraq, and then coming back as we see it now in Syria until Russia intervened. And Russia decided, hey, the U.S. is playing games with this. They're not really attacking ISIS. They're only faking it. We're going to embarrass the U.S. by intervening in Syria and not letting this happen. That explains, Alex, why the globalists, after being permissive for decades during the Cold War and explaining away every Russian piece of aggression, Russian rearmament, oh, they're not a threat, they're not a threat, and suddenly they turn against Russia. It's because they wanted to see Russia increase in armament for their World War III agenda. But when Russia started to stop the globalist agenda in the Middle East, they said, all right, we got to attack Russia now. And that's what explains all of this false intelligence about Russian interference with the election and its effect on Trump. The second false flag that occurred in Syria just this past 3 weeks, which led to Trump's succumbing to his globalist advisors and attacking Syria. That was another false flag attack. It wasn't actually an attack. It was the Syrian chemical arms supply in an arms factory in Syria that was bombed by the Syrians, unknowing that it was a chemical weapons depot. But in any case, this is a very difficult conspiracy to unravel because, as I've just explained about Iran, it's very complicated. It's hard for normal people to wrap their eyes around this kind of machinations that the globalists are capable of conjuring up to fool people. But we must do our best. And I've influenced thousands of people in the United States with my exposing of the phony fall of the Soviet Union. I also exposed the phony coup in Ukraine. I don't know if you followed this, but one thing you can tell about a phony coup is that the mainstream media don't expose what should be obvious to any rational observer. If you remember in 2013 again, I think it was, when this Ukraine coup, it was happening in February. Remember, they were burning tires in the Maidan Independence Square of Kiev. And for some reason or another, the Berkut, the riot police in Ukraine, weren't really taking these people out. They were being very permissive of this revolution going on. They could have cleared them out with automatic weapons and killed everybody, but everyone thought, well, they're holding off because they don't want to appear too ruthless. So they make a deal with the so-called opposition leaders on a Thursday, and the people in the square don't recognize those official opposition leaders as representing them, and so they reject the deal. And so the deal doesn't occur. Yanukovych is still in power as president, pro-Putin communist. And on Friday, all of a sudden, the revolution comes to fruition, and the Berkuts stay in their barracks. They don't defend the government buildings, the presidential palace, and all of a sudden, the opposition people are able to leave their cordoned off areas in the square, take possession of the city palaces, and nobody in the media asks who gave the orders for the Berkut to stay in the barracks. Nobody. Did you hear it in England? I didn't hear it in the United States. I was watching, and that's the first question I asked. Wait a minute. This is a phony coup. There's no way that the Berkut, the riot police, would have stayed in the barracks unless someone in the communist side in Yanukovych administration gave them the orders. Who was Yanukovych fleeing from? They had a few rifles in the opposition, but he had a whole army at his disposal, and yet he had to flee for his life. That sounded like Gorbachev or the phony Russian coup, where the defense ministers had to flee for their lives. From who? Well, no one asked those questions, Alex. And to this very day, people like Paul Craig Roberts, who is an anti-globalist, think that this was a Western coup, but it wasn't a Western coup. It was a coup basically to put in another Russian puppet, Poroshenko, just like Timoshenko was a Russian puppet. She campaigned on anti-communism, yet once she got into power, she didn't remove any of the communists. And Poroshenko, well, what did he do? He discredited the Western-backed government by denying that the Eastern Ukrainians could use to speak Russian after he had promised it in the campaign that they'd be able to speak the language of their choice. He antagonized them. The Ukrainian army was incompetent and they lost all this equipment. Essentially, he's building a case for in its time, this is now kind of on hold. Putin isn't pursuing a stealth invasion while he's working on the Middle East and being the good guy, blocking the globalists, but he still has evil intentions. He still has World War III intentions. And it's my feeling that the globalists are going to let this first strike fall on the United States and perhaps British strategic military forces so that our leaders can come out of their bunkers and say, now, the only way that we can survive and prosecute World War III is to join together in a militarized global government. That's one thing the globalists do not have. It, in one fell stroke, Alex, will destroy the opposition to globalism because we're now in a war with Russia and China. Now, I don't think that they will absorb that nuclear first strike unless they have secret weapon systems hidden away that they can stop any future strikes while they regroup under a militarized global government. That's my theory. That's the only thing that explains why PDD 60 is still in force, why they've never told Trump about it, because if he got good advice, he would remove PDD 60. He would say, yes, defend the U.S., launch on warning. He would take it away. But it's a secret order. And let me tell you frankly, I know military people in the missile forces. They still think that they can launch on warning. But I'll tell you, they can't launch because PDD 60 also removed the alternate launch codes so that submarine commanders cannot launch without direction from the White House. They do not any longer have alternate launch codes in case communications cut off. That means if they don't get the codes, they won't be able to launch on warning. And I think that's how it's going to happen. And no one will know how it happened, but there'll be a big investigation. But the fact remains the U.S. military forces will be nearly obliterated, not cities, but just military forces. The globalists know that the Russians and Chinese don't want to destroy the Western economy. They don't want to hit cities. They want to establish their own version of the New World Order. And so that's why they're planning on hitting U.S. military to decapitate and then blackmail the West into submission. But our globalist leaders in UK and the US come out of their bunkers and say, well, let's fight. We will stop them from striking us anymore, and let's regroup under a militarized global government. Now, I think, Alex, and my theory is that just as the globalists made a deal with Russia to attack Hitler's rear in World War II in order to defeat him, there was a dual purpose. One, to defeat Hitler. He was, I think, also had quite a few satanic connections and revelations keeping him in power. He was deep into the occult, as you know. But I think the globalists, one, they could get rid of the one who was meant to fail, Hitler, and at the same time have an excuse to build up the next enemy, which was Russia. Now, I think during World War III, the globalists will cut a deal with China, and that they will say, if you help us defeat Russia, we'll give you the rest of aid and military technology that you want. And then Russia cannot win with China at its rear and the West at its front. And so I think and this meets globalist purposes because after the war, you have a new Cold War enemy, a huge militarized China. And that gives the globalists an excuse to say we can't disband our global military now. We can't go back to individual sovereignty. We must stand together as a massive globalist army. And that's how I think we lose our freedom. Now, people must be aware of this plan. They must recognize it when it happens, that our globalist leaders are betraying us, that it isn't an accident that a first strike is allowed to fall upon US and British nuclear forces. It is a planned betrayal of national sovereignty. And as we can see, there is an uprising against globalism in France, in Austria, in the Netherlands under Geert Wilders. But in each of these cases, in Europe at least, Trump was an anomaly. The globalists did not intend Trump to win the election, and they're having to really work hard to manipulate him, and successfully so, into doing the globalist agenda without realizing that he's following a globalist agenda. I mean, Trump talked about globalism in the campaign, but he can't see it in front of his eyes because he doesn't know the details about false flag operations and how to see them. He doesn't know how to dig deep into there and decapitate the globalist dark side of government in the CIA and the FBI. I mean, there's a whole cadre of law enforcement people that work for the globalists that have a special ring that meet occasionally and know that they are independent of control of Congress. And Trump, if he knew that, has the power to try to dismantle that, although they would probably try to kill him rather than let that happen. But I think the most important thing we can do is to tell the truth, not be afraid to speak openly that there is a conspiracy, have the data. And, I'm in the process of writing a book called The Modern History of Conspiratorial Power. There are so many books on conspiracy that are flawed, that because the globalists delight in putting out false conspiracy theories in order to muddy the waters so that they're easily discredited. But there's a tremendous amount of evidence to prove the case that the globalists in charge of government were the ones that killed JFK, that they were responsible for the cover-up of the downing of TW-800, that 9/11 was a government operation from beginning to end, including the hiring of the terrorists. And as a military pilot, I can tell you some of the technology of how they did that. But in fact, the mistakes that they make when they do a major false flag terrorist event help build the conspiracy movement, because I would suppose that almost 30% of Americans believe in conspiracy after 9/11 because they made so many mistakes. And they have to work so hard to cover it up, it shows their hand. So this is all part of exposing what they do and getting the people outraged. There was enough outrage to elect Donald Trump in the United States. But the UK, for example, in my opinion, is going through a grand deception in Theresa May running the Brexit. Because Theresa May, as you know, and I know you've covered this, the problems with the Brexit, was against the Brexit. And suddenly she became its biggest champion. And we always must be suspicious when that happens, because the telltale sign was this bill that she put into Parliament, where you inculcate all of EU law into British law, and now we'll take it apart one by one and remove the parts that we don't like. Well, no, why do that? Because once it gets inculcated in law, it's very difficult to remove. It's better to say, no, we'll only pick and choose the things that we want to bring in, and we'll vote on those individually. That's the proper way to do it. But by inculcating it, you're being set up, of course, to absorb this by assimilation. You think you've had a Brexit, and yet she has basically betrayed the Brexit by putting it into UK law. You know much more about that than I do, but we see that in the United States, at least those of us who see this as the globalists working overtime. They're very powerful. They're not about to let this system fall without a fight and without a great deal of deception.
Joel Skousen, thank you very much for everything you've told us today. Thank you.